The sea, which washes the long coastline and numerous islands of Greece, brought our people into contact with each other from very early times. When Sophocles celebrated man's unique achievement, he placed mastery of the sea first.
Many marvels there are, but none so marvelous as man. Over the dark sea he rides, in the teeth of the winter storm, driving through towering spray.
What kind of ships were they in which the Greeks traded across the Ionian Sea and with their colonies in the west? What ships took part in the Battle of Salamis, or fought each other in the internal wars of the 5th century? There were two distinct types of Greek ship, the long and the round, the warship and the merchantman. The contrast between the two is very clear on this black figure cup in the British Museum. Both have masts amidships, a single square sail, and landing ladders. But there the resemblance ends. The warship, its oars arranged on 2 levels, glides through the water with its deadly ram ready to strike on the waterline. The merchantman sits deep in the water and relies on its sail. The largest ships were too heavy to beach and had to be towed in and out of harbour. The gangplank is carried astern because such ships were moored stern to the shore in what is still known as the Mediterranean moor. Ships like this sailed all over the Mediterranean, but we knew very little about their construction until a major discovery was made off the coast of Cyprus at Kyrenia by the marine archaeologist µ'Katsev.
We were searching the coasts of Cyprus for ancient shipwrecks and found several in the autumn of 1967, but our most important find we were led to by Andreas Cariolo. Several years earlier, he had discovered the site of the Kyrenia ship and very kindly took us to it. What we saw was a mound of amphoras, ancient wine jars, and immediately we realized that what was there was intact. We surveyed it, roughly determined its size, but the most important thing was that we were able to ascertain its date by the distinct shape of the jars that form part of the mound. The jars dated to the 4th century BC, and there was no other ship of this period, so we realized its importance and the necessity to undertake its excavation. The first year's work was simply a survey lasting 1 month. In 1968 and 69, during the entireties of the summer, we excavated the ship using a crew of over 30 divers each summer.
It was soon discovered how delicate the timbers were, and so too were the fragments of lead covering the hull. Each piece of wood was identified and mapped before being brought to the surface. The wood had the consistency of soft sponge, and the outer planks were riddled with ancient sea worm, in spite of the lead plating. It had to be thoroughly washed and preserved before an accurate reconstruction could be undertaken, from the stereoscopic photographs on the seabed and several thousand full-scale drawings of the timbers. Ancient ship construction is very different from that of modern ships, and in order to determine the ancient techniques, a full-scale model was made of a section of the hull.
The Kyrenia ship was built as we believe most ancient ships were in antiquity. The keel was first set down on ways, and then the outer hull was completely built up, the shell of the ship. In this case, each plank was edge-joined next one to another, and the means by which each plank was joined edge to edge was by cutting mortises in the edge, into the mortises setting tenons. The upper plank was then set down on the plank already in place, and so the entire shell was built up. Only after the shell was completed did the shipwright shape his frames and set them into the hull, acting as inner reinforcing in order to give the hull even greater strength.
In the reconstruction, the ancient technique had to be reversed because the timbers had been flattened under the weight of the cargo and so lost their original shape.
We have learned a great deal about the design and configuration of the hull. One particular thing I might mention now is that the keel of the Carina ship was curved, and this certainly would have given her very good steerage way, as also a good hold in a reaching sailing leg. We also have found a number of pieces of the standing and running rigging for which there are no parallels from the Greek and Hellenistic periods. We found a steering oar down in the stern area. We believe that this steering oar is in fact a spare. The reason we believe it a spare is because we found no evidence as to how she was lashed or held on board. From the steering oar and also from the mast step, we begin to understand somehow how she was sailed. We believe that she had a single square sail. Our main reason for concluding this is because in the stern, in a locker, we found over 300 lead rings. We believe these are part of a spare sail. These lead rings cannot be associated with any kind of fore and aft rig, but really only effectively work with a square sail. And when we tested it with our fiberglass miniature Mata, we found that she did in fact sail very efficiently with this square sail, and it was amazing how close she could point into the wind.
The Carina ship would have made about 4 or 5 knots in favourable conditions. She was about 15 metres long, probably average for merchantmen in our period. She carried between 20 and 30 tons of cargo. Heavy cargo ships that could not be beached required harbours protected from prevailing winds by moles and from land attack by defensive walls. As Corinth had 2 harbours, she was forced to build walls miles in length to connect them to the main city and Acrocorinth. Corinth grew rich partly because she used her commanding position to control shipping taking a short cut across the isthmus, and so avoiding the projecting fingers of the Peloponnese. In modern times, the Corinth Canal provides easy access from the Corinthian to the Saronic Gulf. The Diolkos, a paved track, ran across the isthmus on much the same lines. Ships, both merchantmen and warships, were dragged along the track on trolleys. The ruts made by the wheels are still visible, 1.5 meters apart. The track is paved with huge poros blocks incised with Corinthian lettering of the early 7th century. There may have been some sort of loading or road signs. In 1956, part of the track was excavated by Dr. Verdelis. He found evidence of superb engineering, and where the tracks curved steeply, there were low ridges to hold the trolley wheels in place. But we can only guess at the mechanical contrivances employed to operate it. From ancient references, we know that the Diolkos was used in the Peloponnesian War. Indeed, it was still in use in the 9th century AD. Like Corinth, Athens in the 6th century was a considerable sea power, but her fleet was subsidiary to her army. Themistocles' policy was to transform Athens into the strongest sea state in Greece. He used the threat of Persian naval activity to persuade the Athenians to move their warships from the open beaches of Phaleron, where they were within sight of the Acropolis, but unprotected from any sudden attack. Themistocles removed the ships to the safety of the natural harbours of Piraeus, which he fortified with walls. The narrow entrance channels could be closed with chains. The fortifications were started 3 years before Marathon and finished after the Persian invasion. Later, Athens herself was connected to Piraeus and the sea by her long walls. Modern Piraeus has overlaid or destroyed most of the harbour installations of ancient Athens. Then, as now, Kantharos was the main commercial harbour. Here the fleet assembled for the ceremonial departure of an expedition at a special jetty. In an emergency, the presiding committee of the assembly met on the actual jetty and stayed in continuous session until the fleet set sail. The fleet was kept in the smaller harbours of Munichia and Zea. Ships of the line were kept out of the water when not in use and under cover to protect them from sun and rain. The shore of the circular harbour of Zea is fringed today by pleasure craft, as in the past it was fringed by Athenian warships in their ship sheds. Remains of slipways cut in the rock can still be glimpsed at the water's edge. 196 ship sheds once fitted into this harbour. Perhaps the comic writer wasn't joking when he put the dockyard first among the glories of Athens. Rigging and other gear was kept in the dockyard storerooms, and in the later 4th century in the famous arsenal built by Philo. Not a stone of the building remains, but an inscription enables us to make a reconstruction. This building was a source of great pride, as were the actual ship sheds. The slips were partly cut in the bedrock and partly built up with stones to make a gentle gradient into the sea. The model shows 3 pairs of slips. The space between the columns was only 19 feet 6 inches in the Zea sheds, and even less in the Munichian ones. The stone slips extended about 120 feet from the water's edge. They also continued under the water, and slight changes in sea level since antiquity must be taken into account when estimating the original dry length of the slips, and so the length of the ships they housed. This explains nautical archaeologists' preoccupation with shipshed dimensions. Unfortunately, the evidence for the Zea shipsheds comes from a rescue excavation of 1885, and very little can be seen today. The shipsheds provide the maximum dimensions for the trireme, which in the absence of an actual ship is very important. It cannot have been longer than 120 feet, and to clear the columns either side, not more than 12 feet 5 inches in beam, with outriggers projecting 2 feet on either side. The trireme had to be light enough to be manhandled by its crew. Warships from earliest times had to be beached stern first because of their projecting rams. Their crews, if possible, dragged them out of the water each day and camped in the shelter of the upcurving sterns. This little model from the Acropolis of Athens dates from the 4th century and is one of our very few three-dimensional models of a warship. Trireme means 3-fitted and refers to the disposition of the oars. But unfortunately, there's an almost complete absence of representations of a trireme in the 5th and 4th centuries. The ᶜᵏᵉ relief, also found on the Acropolis, is the only one showing oars at 3 levels. This has been used for many reconstructions, but no satisfactory model has been devised which allows the lower oarsmen room to complete their strokes. Fortunately, it's a carefully worked out relief. The delicate carving brings out the light superstructure of the Greek warship. The thole pins of the topmost oars are carried by an outrigger, while the lower oars pass through ports cut in the hull. In our period, the crews were drawn from the poorer citizens and resident aliens, and rode naked on leather cushions, shielded from the sun by the deck. As a man-powered missile, the trireme had to outspeed and outmaneuver its opponent. It was kept out of the water when not in use because a waterlogged hull reduced speed. A 19th century drawing of the ᶜᵏᵉ relief shows the bronze ram, designed to hold the enemy at or a little below the waterline. For other supporting evidence, we are reduced to an ornamental drinking cup and a coin. But we do know from the literary evidence that everything was designed for lightness, apart from the keel, which was of oak to withstand the wear and tear of hauling up the beaches. Because it was so lightly built, with no cargo or ballast to preserve and mark it out on the seabed, we are unlikely ever to find the remains of a trireme. But we do know the location of many sea battles. Engagements take place close to the land, the slower ships seeking confined water, the faster room for manoeuvre. A famous tactic was the ᶃᵒᵐᵐ, a single line of ships passing through the enemy fleet drawn up line abreast to attack from the rear. To counter this, the slower fleet would form a circle round its supply ships, rather like the ring of wagons before an Indian attack. These naval tactics are well illustrated at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. In 429, the Athenian general Phormio was guarding the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth with 20 ships when 47 Peloponnesian warships plus other vessels approached. The faster Athenian fleet allowed them to reach open water before attacking. To prevent an Athenian ᶃᵒᵐᵐ, the Peloponnesians made the classic response. Then the Athenians circled the enemy fleet, a maneuver known as periplus, until, aided by the wind, they reduced it to confusion. Thucydides describes the scene.
Ships fell foul of each other and had to be pushed off with poles. With the shouting and swearing and yelling from one boat to another, it was impossible to hear the orders being given by the boatswains. Lacking experience as they did, the Peloponnesians couldn't clear their oars in the rough sea, making the ships more difficult for the steersmen to handle. Then Phormio gave the signal. The Athenians attacked, and after first sinking one of the admiral's ships, went on to destroy every ship they came across.
Athenian naval tactics were based on well-trained crews, faster ships, choice of sea for engagement. When these conditions were not fulfilled, as at Naupactos a month later, or at Syracuse in 413, she could be in trouble. Despite her long, indented coastline and numerous islands, Greece has few natural harbours. Ships hugged the coastline where possible, anchoring or beaching each night so the crews could eat and sleep ashore. Naval warfare and trade were seasonal activities from May to September because of the risk of bad weather. From discoveries on land, we can plot the extent of ancient trade. Amphoras, the barrels of the ancient world, carried wine, olive oil, dates, fish, and inedible substances like pitch. We don't know whether the cargo of the Kyrenia ship was typical or not. She certainly carried large quantities of amphoras, identified by their shape as from Rhodes and Samos, both places renowned for their wine. She also carried blocks of volcanic stone carefully carved with slots. They were finally identified as the remains of a cargo of millstones quarried on the island of Nisyros. And there were nearly 10,000 almonds, perfectly preserved. From this cargo, we can trace the probable course of her last voyage. Leaving Samos, the ship sailed to Nisyros, taking aboard the millstones, and then to the island of Rhodes. Perhaps some of the millstones were traded here for the 300 amphoras of Rhodian wine. The captain may have hoped for buyers further east, perhaps in Cyprus, which was famous for its almonds, or even beyond. But when did the Kyrenia ship go to the bottom? Professor Katzef.
The first clue that we had for dating the shipwreck was from the shape of the amphoras, and particularly the Rhodian amphoras. Rhodes, over antiquity, changed the shape of its amphoras, and these have been very carefully studied so that we can now tie in those amphoras manufactured on Rhodes that were found in the Kyrenia ship to the period between 330 and 300 BC. Like all archaeological sites, though, the best clue for dating is the numismatic evidence. We found only a few coins, a few bronze coins, in the Kyrenia ship. These, fortunately, can be read and further reinforce that the ship must have sank in the latter part of the 4th century, perhaps as late as 300 BC.
Other finds in the wreck, in particular the mass of kitchenware, provide information about the crew and shipboard life.
We found no evidence for any decking amidships in the Carina ship. However, we have found evidence for storage areas fore and aft. And in these areas, we have found the crockery that was used by the crew. Especially in the stern area, we found a large number of vessels used by them. 4 different bowls of the same size, 4 oil jugs, 4 pitchers to pour into for canthroy, wine cups, and finally we've also found fragments of 4 wooden spoons. It seems to me that the conclusion is inescapable, that we are dealing with a ship that was manned by a captain and 3 sailors. We've also found quite a bit of material to tell us what they ate: grape seeds, hazelnuts, olives, fig seeds, and we've also found a fragment of a garlic clove. Besides this organic material, I think we can also conclude that they must have eaten fish on board, for we found over 300 weights of lead that must have been attached to a fishing net, and we've also found a hook that would have been used to catch fish. We have found other implements that they would have used for cooking. Here, for instance, is a large copper cauldron, perhaps the communal cooking vessel. And in order to spoon the contents from the cauldron or the castle, they very possibly used a very handsome bronze ladle that we found.
We shall never know for certain why the Kyrenia ship sank. Underwater excavation is a prolonged and costly business, and it will be many years before other key sites have been found and fully excavated.
In antiquity, the nation that controlled the seas could control her destiny. In the classical and Hellenistic periods, it was Greece who held that power. We had little knowledge of her warships and her merchant marine. But with the discovery of the Carina ship, its excavation and reconstruction, we have now, through this one example, been able to contribute an immense amount of knowledge. And we hope that by reassembling her, students and scholars will be able to come and study the remains and learn even more about the ships and the seafaring that were so important in antiquity.